At 10:30 in the morning on October 30th, 1942, a damaged American carrier lay at anchor in Noma Harbor, New Caledonia. Her flight deck was torn open by bomb craters. Her forward elevator was jammed. Her hull was bent outward where near misses had slammed the ocean into her side. With the force of a hammer, all still seeped quietly into the water. On paper, she was a casualty. In reality, she was the last hope. The ship was USS Enterprise, CV-6, 25,000 tons of steel, 824 feet long. The most decorated warship the United States would ever send to sea. For days earlier, she had barely survived the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. 44 men were dead. Dozens more were wounded. Regulations, doctrine, and common sense all agreed on one thing. Enterprise belonged in a shipyard, not in a war. But there was a problem. There were no spare carriers. Lexington was on the bottom of the Coral Sea. Yorktown lay off Midway. Wasp had gone down in September. Hornet had just been finished off at Santa Cruz. Saratoga was in Pearl Harbor with a torpedo wound. In the entire Pacific, the United States Navy had exactly one operational fleet carrier left, Enterprise. If she failed, the road to Guadalcanal was wide open. Japanese officers knew it, or thought they did. Their communiques had already claimed Enterprise sunk more than once. After the Eastern Solomons, they reported her destruction. After Santa Cruz, they did it again. Yet every time they wrote her off, she came back, scarred and patched, launching strikes from a deck that looked like a salvage yard. They started calling her something new, the Gray Ghost, the carrier that refused to die. On that broken flight deck at Noma stood the man who would make sure she kept that reputation. Lieutenant Commander Herschel Albert Smith, Enterprise's damage control officer. Smith wasn't a famous admiral or a fighter ace. He was a quiet professional from Michigan, Naval Academy class of 1922, whose specialty was keeping ships alive after they'd been hit. He knew where Enterprise was strong, where she was fragile, how fire would move through her ventilation trunks, how flooding would creep through frames and seams if it wasn't stopped quickly enough. He earned that knowledge the hard way. He had walked her compartments from bow to stern, crawled into void spaces most officers never saw, memorized the routes of power runs, fire mains, ventilation ducts, pump lines. When something exploded on board, Smith did not need a blueprint. He could close his eyes and see the damage spreading through steel. Long before Santa Cruz, he had prepared for that moment. Enterprise drilled damage control the way other ships drilled gunnery. Fire drills, flooding drills, bomb-hit drills. In daylight and in darkness, in calm seas and in heavy swell. Men learned to drag hoses blind, to put on breathing gear in seconds, to rig shoring on a bulkhead that was groaning under pressure. They practiced until their hands moved faster than their fear. In August 1942, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, those drills stopped being theory. A Japanese bomb slammed into Enterprise, punched through the flight deck, and detonated deep inside her hull. Lights failed. Compartments filled with smoke. Fire licked toward spaces that could not be allowed to burn. Smith was on the bridge when the shock rolled through the ship. He did not wait to be told what had happened. He was already running down the ladders. By the time he reached the damaged area, his teams were in motion. Foam hissed across burning debris. Wounded men were being dragged clear. Hoses snaked through passageways. Smith took one look and began issuing orders. Isolate this circuit, vent that space, reinforce this bulkhead, flood that compartment, pump that one dry. The goal was simple. Keep the damage small. Keep the ship in the fight. Enterprise lived through Eastern Solomons because her crew treated catastrophe like a checklist. 2 months later at Santa Cruz, the test was harder. On October 26, 1942, Japanese carrier air groups found Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Guadalcanal. Hornet would not survive the day. Enterprise almost didn't. Within a few minutes, she took to direct bomb hits and to near misses that hit like sledgehammers. Compartments forward flooded. Fire broke out near critical spaces. Men died where they stood. Smith was below decks when the first bomb struck. The blast knocked him flat, shattered lighting, filled passageways with smoke and dust. As emergency lights flickered on, he was already on his feet, heading toward the worst of the noise and heat. The second bomb hit while he was still moving forward, throwing him sideways into a steel bulkhead. His ears rang, his head spun. He did what experienced sailors always do when they're not sure how badly they're hurt. He got up and kept going. What he walked into was hell. Smoke so thick you could only see by the glow of fire. Men shouting over each other, some giving orders, some just screaming. Cables hung from overhead, arsing and spitting. Water poured from ruptured fire mains where bombs had torn through the pipes, designed to fight flames. If nothing changed fast, that water would soon be mixing with fuel oil and molten metal. Smith's job wasn't to be brave, it was to be precise. He didn't shout generalities. He gave exact commands. Clear this passage. Cut that power line. Close this hatch and dog it down. Vent this way, not that way. Get foam on that fire, seawater on that bulkhead. Protect the magazines at all costs. Every order came with an understanding. If they were wrong, the ship would die. On paper, the pattern of damage from Santa Cruz was enough to doom a carrier. Two bombs penetrating deep into the hull, near misses buckling plates. Flooding in multiple compartments, structural members bent, fire near vital spaces. In practice, Enterprise stayed afloat. She turned away from the battle, wounded but moving under her own power. Steaming toward Noma with her dead stitched in canvas and her survivors still at their stations. For days later, those same men were working alongside a new kind of crew, the Seabees. The 75 men of the construction battalion were not part of Enterprise's regular complement. They were welders, carpenters, riggers, men who were used to building airfields and piers, not patching warships under combat conditions. But at Noma they became part of the ship whether they liked it or not. Smith walked them through what had to be done. Flight deck pads here and here, temporary reinforcement over that damaged elevator, patching along the starboard bulge where near misses had battered the hull. It wasn't about making the ship pretty. It was about making her barely strong enough to absorb one more hit without breaking in half. Welding arcs lit the harbor night. Steel plates went down over holes in the deck that were still black at the edges from bomb blasts. Wooden plugs were driven into twisted gaps where nothing else would fit. Pumps worked constantly to keep up with slow leaks from battered tanks. The forward elevator remained dead, a gaping weakness in the ship's profile. By every textbook in the Navy, Enterprise needed months in a major yard. She got for days at a forward base. And then the war caught up. On November 10th, American commanders in the South Pacific received news that changed the situation from desperate to critical. Japanese battleships and transports were heading for Guadalcanal. Their mission was simple and deadly. Level Henderson Field with gunfire, land thousands of reinforcements, and finally throw the Marines back into the sea. If Henderson fell, the Americans would lose their airfield, their foothold on the island, and their ability to contest the Central Solomons. If Henderson survived, it could continue to launch aircraft that made every Japanese convoy gamble. There was only one fleet carrier that could put a strong air group close enough to influence that fight, Enterprise. On board, Captain Osborne Hardison read the orders. He had been in command for just 10 days. He called for Smith. Between them lay a set of damage reports that were honest to the point of brutality. Compromised watertight integrity forward. Hull still deformed on the starboard side. A patched flight deck, a jammed elevator, spaces that were watertight enough but not as designed. Hardison asked a single question: can she fight? Smith did not tell him what he wanted to hear. He told him what he needed to hear. If the ship took another bomb in the forward areas, the temporary repairs might tear open. If a torpedo struck near the buckled frames, flooding might outrun their pumps. Another serious hit in the wrong place could send Enterprise to the bottom in minutes. Then he answered the question. Her boilers still made steam. Her engines still turned. She could steer. Her catapults worked. Her resting gear worked. She could launch and recover aircraft. Yes, in other words, she can fight. She might not come back, but she can fight. At dawn on November 11th, 1942, Enterprise steamed out of Noma with welders still working on her deck, with hammers still echoing through her hull, with Seabees still bunking in temporary spaces. Noise from air tools blended with the thump of catapults and the whine of aircraft engines. As her battered air group prepared for the next round. The carrier that should have been in dry dock was going to war instead. What followed over the next 4 days was not a clean, single battle. It was a series of interconnected fights on the sea and in the air that together became known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, one of the most brutal sequences of engagements in the Pacific. Enterprise's role was simple. She had to put bombs and torpedoes onto the ships trying to kill Henderson Field. On November 12th, her aircraft found one of the first targets, the heavy cruiser Kinugasa, a veteran Japanese ship that had shelled Guadalcanal the previous night. The cruiser believed she had slipped away into open water. She had not. Dive bombers from Enterprise, SBT Dauntlesses flown by men who had been in combat for most of the year, rolled in from altitude. They had practiced dives like this on targets that did not shoot back. Now anti-aircraft fire clawed at them as they dropped nearly vertically toward a rolling deck. Their bomb release had to be timed in seconds. Their pull-out precise to keep wings from tearing off under the gelo. They hit Kinugasa hard. Fires erupted. Flooding followed. Within hours, the cruiser rolled and went under, taking hundreds of sailors with her. It was one ship, one kill, one less heavy gun to threaten the Marines ashore. That night, November 12th into the early hours of the 13th, the fighting shifted to the surface. American cruisers and destroyers met Japanese battleship Hai and her escorts at shockingly close range in the dark off Guadalcanal. Radar, searchlights, star shells, blind firing. The engagement was chaotic and savage. The U.S. force paid heavily in ships and lives, but they left Hai battered, burning, and barely moving. At dawn, Enterprise's turn came again. Her scouts found Hai limping along at low speed, listing bleeding O. She could still fire her big guns. She could still reach Henderson Field if she somehow survived. Enterprise's Dauntlesses went in carrying 1,000-pound bombs. Her Avengers came in low, torpedoes slung under their bellies. They attacked in concert with Marine aircraft from Henderson. Dive bombers rained explosives in from above, while torpedo bombers ran in at wavetop height, dropping weapons that ran shallow toward the battleship's side. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews fought back with everything they had left. They shot down some of the attackers. They could not stop all of them. Bombs smashed into Hai's superstructure. Torpedoes detonated along her hull. Compartments flooded. Fires raged uncontrolled. By evening, the first Japanese battleship ever lost in World War I slipped beneath the waves, not from gunfire alone, but from a combined pounding by ships and aircraft, many of which had flown from a carrier that technically had no business being at sea. The convoy threat remained. On November 14th, Enterprise's aircraft found Japanese transports pushing south, loaded with thousands of soldiers and their equipment, artillery, ammunition, supplies. The weight needed to drive the Guadalcanal defenders off the island. The transports were big, slow, and fatally vulnerable to bombs. Dauntlesses from Enterprise attacked in classic near-vertical dives. Marines from Henderson joined in. Later, Army B-17s added high-altitude bombs to the storm. Transports burned, broke apart, capsized. Water that morning was filled not only with wreckage, but with men who had been soldiers an hour before and were now struggling in the open ocean, with little chance of rescue. The few transports that survived tried to run themselves aground near Guadalcanal, to spill their remaining troops onto the beach. Some made it, burning as they beached, their surviving soldiers scrambling ashore with little more than rifles and uniforms. Almost all of their heavy equipment was gone, lying on the sea floor. That night, November 14th into the 15th, battleships took center stage. USS Washington and USS South Dakota engaged Japanese battleship Kirishima and her escorts in another violent night action. When the firing finally ceased and Kirishima joined Hai on the bottom, the Japanese High Command understood something crucial had changed. They had not just lost ships, they had lost the last real chance to retake Guadalcanal. Through all of this, Enterprise kept launching airplanes. Her pilots flew multiple sorties a day, often on minimal sleep and bad weather, over open ocean where a navigation mistake could mean never seeing land again. Her deck crews kept battered, aircraft patched up and turning around. Her damage control teams stayed on alert at all times, fully aware that one lucky hit on their compromised hull might be the end. The emergency repairs that Smith and the Seabees had overseen at Noma were tested under real fire. They held. By the time Enterprise returned to port after the fighting, Henderson Field was still in American hands. The Japanese had lost to battleships, a heavy cruiser, and most of a reinforcement convoy. They would never again mount an offensive of that scale around Guadalcanal. Over the months that followed, they quietly evacuated their remaining troops from the island they had once been certain they would dominate. All of it had hinged, in part, on a single damaged carrier that went to sea while she was still under repair. The story of Enterprise at Guadalcanal was dramatic, but it was not an isolated miracle. The Grey Ghost had been escaping death since before the United States officially entered the war. She had been scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor in early December 1941. Bad weather delayed her. On December 7th, her aircraft flew into a sky already filled with Japanese bombs and American anti-aircraft fire. Some of her pilots were shot down by both sides. Enterprise herself arrived to a harbor in ruins the next day, one of the few major ships still afloat and ready to fight. In early 1942, she led some of the first offensive carrier raids into the Marshall Islands. In April, she escorted USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, providing fighter cover while Army B-25s did something most planners had considered impossible: launch medium bombers from a carrier deck to strike the Japanese home islands. In June, she sailed into the most important carrier battle of the war, Midway. There, Enterprise's dive bombers, led into position by Wade McCluskey's decision to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, found the main Japanese carrier force at exactly the wrong moment. Decks full of fueled and armed aircraft, Cruz rushing to rearm for a second strike. Minutes later, 3 Japanese carriers were burning so fiercely that their own men could not save them. The 4th followed that afternoon. Enterprise's air group played a central role in a victory that fundamentally changed the balance in the Pacific. She fought at the Eastern Solomons. She fought at Santa Cruz. She fought at Guadalcanal when logic said she should have been laid up in a dockyard. And when new Essex-class carriers finally joined the fleet in 1943 and 1944. Enterprise did not retire to the background. She kept going through the Gilberts, the Marshalls, Truk, the Marianas, the Philippine Sea. Like Gulf raids on the Japanese home islands, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. She survived bombs, near misses, and kamikaze attacks. She pioneered night carrier operations, launching fighters and bombers in darkness when no other navy in the world could do it reliably. By the end of the war, she had earned more battle stars than any other American ship. Her aircraft were credited with shooting down hundreds of enemy planes, sinking dozens of ships, and damaging many more. She steamed hundreds of thousands of miles in combat. And then, when the war was over, she met an end that no bomb or torpedo could deliver. Enterprise was decommissioned in 1947. There were plans, briefly, to preserve her as a museum. Fundraising campaigns were announced. Committees met. Nothing came of it. By the late 1950s, the money was gone, the public's attention had shifted, and the ship that had been too tough for the Imperial Japanese Navy proved no match for budgets and bureaucracy. In 1958, USS Enterprise CV-6 was sold for scrap. By 1960, the Grey Ghost existed only in pieces, an anchor here, a bell there, some fittings and private collections, a stern plate mounted in a small town. The most decorated ship in U.S. naval history was reduced to steel that would be melted, rolled, and turned into something unremarkable. The lessons from her life remained. Enterprise showed what carrier warfare actually looks like in a real war. Not sleek perfection, but damaged decks, rushed repairs, exhausted crews, and ships that go back out because there is no choice. She showed what damage control, training, and improvisation can do when technology and bravery alone are not enough. She showed how much difference one ship can make when the strategic moment is narrow, and the stakes are enormous. She also showed how easy it is for a nation to forget even its greatest instruments of war. As soon as peace returns, later carriers would carry her name, a nuclear-powered Enterprise, and soon another in the Ford class, but the story of the original Grey Ghost is still carried mostly in documents, in photographs, and in the memories of the men who served aboard her, many of whom went back to quiet lives after the war and never thought of themselves as heroes. They kept a wounded ship alive long enough to change the trajectory of the Pacific War. History, at its core, is made of choices like that. What most people never realize is that the story of the Enterprise was not only about bombs, torpedoes, and battles. It was also about the evolution of naval doctrine, rapid technological adaptation, and the ability of ordinary sailors to solve impossible problems under conditions that should have broken them. The ship became something far greater than a carrier. She turned into a floating laboratory where new ideas were tested in real combat, often for the first time in history. One of the most overlooked reasons the Enterprise survived so many battles was the American approach to damage control. While Japanese carriers were fast and carried large air groups, their internal design made them dangerously vulnerable. Their fuel lines were poorly insulated, their firefighting systems were inadequate, and their hangar decks were not separated by fireproof bulkheads. It meant that when a bomb hit a Japanese carrier during rearming or refueling, the entire deck could ignite within seconds. This was exactly what happened at Midway. Enterprise, by contrast, had layers of redundancy built into her design. Her fuel systems were protected, her pumps were powerful, and her internal compartments allowed repair teams to isolate damage quickly. The American Navy trained its crews relentlessly in emergency procedures. Every sailor knew where the hoses were, where the extinguishers were, and how to operate basic equipment even outside his specialty. But design alone wasn't what saved the ship. What saved her was coordination. The crew operated like a single organism, reacting almost instantly to any threat. Japanese analysts after the war studied American carriers and wrote reports concluding that a single U.S. carrier often absorbed more structural punishment in one battle than several Japanese carriers had taken over the entire war. Enterprise stood at the top of that list. She endured direct bomb strikes, near misses, and kamikaze hits that should have crippled her, yet she stayed afloat, launched aircraft, and kept fighting. Another part of the Enterprise story that rarely appears in documentaries is the industrial miracle that kept her alive. In 1942, she was effectively the only functioning American fleet carrier in the South Pacific. Losing her would have meant abandoning Guadalcanal. To prevent this, the United States created an improvised but incredibly efficient logistical chain stretching thousands of miles. Factories on the West Coast produced replacement parts specifically for the Enterprise. Knowing she was the fleet's last hope, cargo ships carried everything from steel plates to electrical wiring. Even seaplanes transported smaller components that had to reach the front quickly. The Enterprise became the first carrier to receive structural repairs, while still launching combat sorties, which forced the Navy to rethink how mobile repairs should be executed. The human experience aboard the ship was just as extraordinary. During the critical days of November 1942, crew members worked under levels of exhaustion that modern militaries consider unsafe. Pilots returned from missions shaking from adrenaline, unable to unclench their hands from the controls. Some mechanics fell asleep standing up, leaning on bulkheads for support. There were moments when men fighting fires below decks had only minutes of breathable air in smoke-filled compartments, but they kept working because they understood the stakes. If Enterprise sank, Guadalcanal would fall, and with it the first major American foothold in the Pacific. The constant strain forged a unique identity among the crew. They began to believe the ship simply could not die. Sailors sent to other vessels later admitted they never felt the same sense of invincibility anywhere else. Enterprise had earned her nickname not only from Japanese reports, but from her own crew's stubborn refusal to let her stop fighting. As 1942 turned into 1943, the Enterprise quietly reshaped the future of naval aviation. Many of the tactics later considered standard were first tested on her decks. She pioneered the concept of launching strike groups in rotating cycles, rather than single massive waves. This kept pressure on the enemy and prevented Japanese forces from recovering between bomb runs. She also became one of the first carriers to use radar to direct fighters with precision, giving her air wing a significant advantage in defending the fleet. These innovations later became foundational practices in the U.S. Navy. Even the Combat Information Center, today the nerve center of every modern warship, had some of its earliest practical applications aboard Enterprise. Sailors began combining radar plots, radio intercepts, and visual reports into a unified tactical picture. This gave commanders a level of situational awareness that Japanese fleets lacked entirely. What appears routine today was groundbreaking then. Captured Japanese records reveal another extraordinary detail. Enterprise became the most hunted American ship in the Pacific. Japanese planners repeatedly designated her as a top priority target. Their intelligence units noted that no matter how badly damaged she was reported to be, she always returned to battle in a surprisingly short time. They treated her as a symbol of American resilience. Some Japanese officers even believed the United States had built multiple ships with the same name. To confuse them, the truth was that there was only one, and the Japanese never managed to sink her. What gives the Enterprise story its lasting power is not only what she did during the war, but what she meant afterward, even after she was scrapped. The lessons learned from her operations influenced every generation of carriers that followed. Her night fighting techniques shaped post-war doctrine. Her damage control procedures became required study material, and her success during repairs at sea helped define the concept of mobile naval support. If you want to hear more stories like this, real events, real people, real engineering and decision-making behind World War E, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and telling us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps keep these stories from sinking into the past, the way the Grey Ghost nearly did so many times before she finally disappeared from the sea.